Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. My guest today is Dr. Brian Poncy. Brian is a professor of school psychology at Oklahoma State University. His research focuses on academic interventions and behavioral principles of learning, specifically in the area of mathematics. Dr. Poncy created the Measures and Interventions for Numeracy Development, Mind, and Facts on Fire, a set of free materials to support teachers in the assessment and implementation of empirically validated interventions to increase early numeracy and computation skills. He is co-author of Effective Math Interventions, a guide to improving whole number knowledge. I think you're going to find this one interesting. I think you're going to like it. Brian, thank you so much for being on Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love listening to your podcast, and so let's get cracking.
All right. Well, I have heard you on several podcasts and talking about fluency, fact fluency, and I know you have a couple programs. Could you describe the programs that you've developed and kind of how they are available to folks?
Yeah. I'm a school psychologist by training. And because of that, when I worked in schools, and now that I'm a professor, we have practicum students that are out in schools. And so invariably we get children referred to us, that struggle with their basic facts in math. But I mean, whether it's reading or math or writing, kids generally are just not fluent or accurate or fluent in their kind of basic skills. And so I saw this a decade ago. And so I created what was called the Measures and Interventions for Numeracy Development, MIND, with has periods in between because somebody else has mind math and mine. They contacted me and
right,
people
sure.
were getting confused. So anyway, but what I did was really that was a resource for tiered supports. And it was basically like, we're going to kind of task analyze these computation skills, and we're going to have kind of sub-skill mastery measures where you can assess students, look at patterns in responding, and then there's basically 4 interventions that you could use: flashcard drill, cover copy compare, tape problems, and explicit timing. And basically we had intervention materials, supports, treatment integrity forms, and so that people could drive those types of practices in their schools. And so that was the initial one. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you listed the 4. Could you list them again quickly so I don't have to remember them?
Yeah, the flashcard drill. And of course, flashcards are the vehicle, the drill and practice is the instruction. And so,
right.
We kind of get into ratios to start with, and then how to adapt that based off a student responding. Cover copy compare is where you have a problem, the problem's on the page with a space next to it. The kids look at it, they cover it, they write it, and then they uncover it to make sure they're correct. So it's basically a self-mediated flashcard intervention where the kid kind of does it. Tape problems is a time delay procedure, and that is when a child will look at a problem like 3 plus 8, and then the tape will read 3 plus 8 is, and it gives a 2-second delay, and they have to try to beat that. And if they don't, they get immediate feedback on that. So again, with those 3, whether it's flashcard drill, cover copy compare, tape problem, there's an antecedent component to all of those. And then obviously the student responds, but in all of those, the child gets immediate feedback on whether they're right or wrong. So those interventions are really good to build accurate responding. And obviously, if you're working one-on-one with flashcards versus versus take problems, which you could do in a group, you see that saliency of the antecedent and the consequent procedures kind of lessen. And what that does is it allows for increased rates of responding, and you're kind of fading that support for students until then you would go to explicit timing, which is timed retrieval practice. But again,
Yeah.
that take problems is that bridge there, right? Because it has the immediate feedback, but what you're really doing is you're trying to get the child to kind of independently retrieve that before they need the consequent procedure or the feedback on it.
You basically answered my follow-up question, which is everybody's heard of flashcards. Everybody's heard of the things that you've talked about, but it's not necessarily it's the flashcard. It is how you implement what you're doing with the kids. So let's just take flashcards for a second. You have some, I'm going to say strict guidelines. You have some protocols for the teachers to use. Where do teachers Where have you found that the flashcards have not been used properly, that you don't get the impact that it could have had?
Yeah, so it's all about set size, opportunities to respond, and repetitions, right? So, for example, the flashcard is it's just literally a medium for the information. And so if I was at home and I was teaching 50 sight words and I went through them all one time, it's not going to work, right? And so again, so what I see is that people need to control those ratios. So there's a really interesting study that's it's old, it's 2008, but it's NIST and Joseph, and they compared all unknowns, a folding in technique, which was like three unknowns to six knowns, and then incremental rehearsal, which was one known to nine unknowns. And anyway, they compared all of those three, and they looked at the amount of words learned. And then they also looked at the kind of efficiency and the rate of learning. And so what they found was the most effective was incremental rehearsal, but it also took the most time. And so, so most kids responded best to all unknown, right? And when I said that, that would be words learned per instructional minute, but the amount of words learned per session, the most was with incremental rehearsal. And if we think about that, it's really all about OTRs or repetitions. And so when I'm working with kids from typically developing to maybe intellectually disabled, it's all about understanding the set size and the OTR. So I could do 10 flashcards with 5 repetitions, see how the kid does. Let's say they don't. So then I could do 5 cards with 10 repetitions. In both cases, the kid would get, 50 repetitions in their sight words. And then like if you could do 10 words with 5 repetitions, obviously you would want to do that. But if that didn't work for the student, you could do 5 cards with 10 repetitions. And so you kind of search for those ratios to see, how a child learns most efficiently. And that should be kind of the purpose of response to intervention models, when we look at special education eligibility.
Okay, I want to talk a lot more about that later, but just kind of a clarification here or on the expectations of this program, because you mentioned, this has been going on for years. It's been going on I've only been in education since 1977, and it's been going on since then. And it's almost has been, and then when I started consulting in lots of schools, it would be the same thing. It's like, well, we have our kids don't know math facts. And the question should be, well, what are you doing about it? Okay. So if you're doing something like your program, let's say in a general ed setting, is are these is this program appropriate for a general ed setting?
Well, the initial one, we kind of combined interventions and we did cover, copy, compare, and explicit timing. And so I called it the skill remediation package. And so basically, what a teacher would do was they would assess every kid in the class. They would place them in their instructional level. And then, that might be in a 4th grade classroom. You had sums to 10, sums to 18, multiplication, all over the place, right? But you could have 30 kids on different things all working in unison because the intervention procedures were the same, right? It was 4 2-minute blocks, and kids were either using cover, copy, compare if they were kind of low with fluency and needed to focus on some accuracy building components, or it would be all explicit timing. right? But what was interesting is where we differentiated it was with the curriculum. So the intervention procedures were the same. The curricular materials were differentiated across students. And so in that case, I was like, I came up with a great intervention. But guess what? I started like teachers were like, I would get these superstar teachers that would find it because, I never really talked about, and I wasn't on a podcast till like 2024, and they would get it and they would be like, this is so great and it's free and it works. I'm going to get my colleagues to do it. And the colleagues were like, oh gosh, no, this is way too much work because you had to assess the kids, place the kids, do intervention all week, score it, see if the kids moved from skill or intervention. You'd have to reprint stuff for the next week. And so there's constantly this kind of assessment and intervention feedback loop, which I thought was fantastic. But I mean, teachers don't have time to go to the restroom sometimes during the day. So obviously asking them to do these things, it was too large of a lift. And so then as teachers, kind of communicated these things with me, I was like, I need to come up with something for tier 1 to support teachers. And that's where Facts on Fire 2.0 came in. And my goal with that is I need to lessen the amount of effort on the teacher. I need to ensure, that it works really well with kids. I need to kind of, keep kids uniform since it is tier 1.5, as Dr. Vanderheyden calls it. But I mean, honestly, and the other thing is, as a school psychology person going in and assessing, it was never an isolated 20% of kids that were struggling with math facts. It's widespread. And so, like, I mean, I know when I go into any school, I don't even tell them, well, why don't you assess your kids and see if they don't know their facts? Because I've yet to have anybody come back and be like, yep, our kids are pretty fluent with their math. Not one time.
Oh,
Not one time. I mean,
yeah.
I was talking to a school today, and they assessed their kids up to 4th grade. And, they use illustrative math as their core curriculum. And all of their kids started at sums to 10, whether they were in 1st grade or 10th grade. And they supplemented with Jennifer Bay Williams. And, their math specialist and people were doing probably a wonderful job teaching the things they were taught in their colleges of ed, which was, we don't want kids to memorize their facts because that's going to prevent them from multiple strategies and coming up with things on their own. And that to me is kind of the crux right now in education. Like any 4th grade teacher will tell you, I can't teach what I'm supposed to teach because kids can't access the curriculum. But if you ask people, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And it's like, well, we want kids to think flexibly. Like that's the big definition of NCTM with fluency, is about flexibility. And that's a really important skill for kids to have. But if they build accuracy and then they memorize the fact, that is the bridge to the multiple strategies and flexibility. And so again, there's kind of research that shows this. It's correlational. There's not a ton of it out there, but as I see it, and I think the data that's coming in from my grant work and some other things where we're using Facts on Fire, broad math scores are going up quite a bit from just 6 minutes of, timed practice. And that's probably due to the fact that it is increasing kids' skill and allowing them access to the curricula, which most core curricula are focused on representations and multiple strategies.
All right. So you touched on my next question because I think if folks are listening to this podcast, we'll just stipulate what you just said. We agree with the kids needing to know their math facts. So then the next question is, well, the first question is, what do we do? And you answered that. You've got your program. Now the question is, like, how much time does it take? What is actually the investment of time in a day, in a week, for a tier 1 classroom teacher to be able to administer and oversee this program?
I would say 10 minutes, and I'm being liberal, right? So there's a tape problems and an explicit timing piece. The tape problems takes about 3.5 minutes to 4 minutes, and then the explicit timing is 1 minute. And we have a whiteboard type, like you would download it, you would get it on the whiteboard, it reads the directions, it times everything out. The students have their workbooks that match kind of the instruction. And so if a teacher is really good with her transitions, she can have it done in 6 minutes per day. And so, so 6 minutes per day, obviously is 30 minutes per week.
Wow. Okay. And just to be clear, because the first time I heard you talk about the taped component, I was a little bit confused because I know Eureka Math uses a tape model. So, but when you say tape, are you talking about recorded? There's something recorded.
Yeah, back when I was in graduate school, we used tape
Okay.
record.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
we went to CDs, but yeah, it's basically an audio cue.
Okay.
Yeah, it paces the kids. And again, the program is very carefully sequenced with its sets. And so, like when I talked a little bit about flashcards and what makes them effective or ineffective, so if we take sums to 10, Facts on Fire is literally 30 lessons. And there's 12 problems in the first 15 lessons, and then there's 12 problems in the second. So when you assess for 1 minute and get a baseline on all of those 16 problems. For most kids, it's usually around 6 to 10 problems per minute. Okay. And then lesson one, we isolate 4 problems. And so that taped problems piece, it does 4 items. So it restricts it to 4 items. It does 6 repetitions. And then the following 1 minute timing times them on only those 4 problems. Okay, and then it goes to lesson two. It folds out 1 problem, it folds in 1 problem, and they do the same thing. And so over the initial first 15 lessons, the first 10 of those is just systematically incorporating, new items. So by the time they're done with the 10 lessons, they've been exposed to all 12 items in very small sets with high repetition. So in tape problems, 4 items, 6 repetitions. And then, of course, they go into the timed practice so that they can independently complete those, right? And then the last 5 lessons of that 15 lesson is we call warming up, and that is just retrieval practice.
So this is all laid out for the teachers. And let's assume that a teacher does this. Is there a percentage of kids that are not going to learn their math facts this way? Does this, I guess I'm asking, does this work for everybody? Is there checkpoints to be able to say, well, maybe we need to do some of the interventions that you talked about earlier? What should be the expectation in a tier one class?
It's such a fantastic question. And unfortunately, it is not the panacea and cure all that I hoped it would be. What happens is kids need to obviously have, like if you start the program, it goes all the way back to kindergarten, and kids have to count, they have to write numbers, and then they subitize, and then they combine kind of sets and learn larger and smaller. And so, there's things that happen. So, when we start with sums to 6, kids already can count, they have one-to-one correspondence, they've practiced these things. And this works great when a kid starts from kindergarten and goes through the whole program. So you're never going to put a kid in unless they have prerequisite skills kind of known and able to do those fluently. But when teachers start this in like 4th grade, there's a whole host of skills that kids might have been taught and might have learned, right? Might not have learned. And so that complicates things. And so what we're finding with our initial results is your typical kid will generally double their baseline to the end of the program facts. And so the end of the program is usually either a 6 or a 9 week, kind of investment. And so if a kid starts, and I do things with problems per minute, not digits correct per minute. But anyway, kids generally will start between 8 and 12. And then at the end of the intervention, they're generally up in that 20 to 25 problem per minute range.
Okay,
And so
I just want to be clear again in the language. You're calling the entire program an intervention. You're not talking about let's take these kids out, let's have an intervention teacher. This is an intervention for the entire class for math.
that's right.
Okay.
Because again, you go into any school and their core curriculum are generally, more inquiry and concept based, which I'm fine with. But because they are so ambitious and teaching so many standards and concepts, they don't really provide that. They don't provide that time for dedicated practice. And that's where Facts on Fire comes in. And so you basically know, regardless of what you're doing, probably supplementation to kind of automatize your basic facts is a good idea.
Well, it's interesting. Like I said, I just talked about the word intervention. And because I know I've talked to Sarah Powell before, University of Texas and her math, and she started out as an interventionist, working with struggling kids, not necessarily identified for special ed, but struggling students, as you talked about here. And then I've talked to Sarah Oberly about executive functions and how, these are for all kids. And I talked to Faith Howard about the literacy work she's doing in secondary with her intervention. But what she's doing in her intervention class is exactly what she's doing with her regular ed students. So I've always been puzzled by these programs that are successful and that have been proven successful. Why haven't they migrated to tier one and just say, this is what we do in tier one instruction?
Yeah, because generally really successful interventions like mine, they're reduced down to a very kind of target skill, right? So I look at computation. When I go out and I train schools, I never tell them like, well, you get your kids automatic in their math facts, we're done, pat ourselves on the back, this is fantastic, right? Like literally, if all my program did was affect their fact scores, their computation scores, and not their broad math scores, then why would we do what we're doing? But where I think core curricula, they try to be everything to everybody, and because they do that, they're jack of all trades, master of none, so to speak. And so what people like Dr. Powell have done is, look at vocabulary instruction or schema instruction or me with computation instruction. And we've just said we are going to very carefully scope and sequence what we do, how we design it, how we sequence it. So kids are constantly being introduced to one new thing all the time, right? And as compared to you may go a week and now you do another unit that's not even related to it, right? And so it's just not scope and sequenced in a way that's skill focused. It's more idea focused, I think, in those core curricula. And of course, we know to think and to kind of connect concepts and ideas, we have to have a lot of skills. Well, I think sometimes the core curriculums focus on concepts and ideas really outpaces the skills they're building within the students. What we do is just focus on the skills. And then lo and behold, when kids get the vocabulary and the fact skills and the schemas, now all of a sudden when teachers are teaching, the concepts and the ideas, they have the things to connect, they have access to it. And, the same teacher that was ineffective like 2 years before they do Facts on Fire, now all of a sudden their state test scores increase a lot and their MAP scores or their benchmark scores increase because the kids coming to them have that better skill base. And so it's not all or none, right? It's we need to do, and it's not about balance either. So I hate that term, but I mean, we have to be very systematic and programmed about how we design curriculum, match instruction to that. And, as the Dr. Overly like talked about on your podcast, right? Like there's things, especially for young kids, that we need to take into account. So, for example, when she talked about executive functioning, well, think about my program. They get the same whiteboard, the same directions, the same structure. Everything's predictable. They're setting goals, the routine's all there. Well, what's that do? It allows the student to focus in on exactly what we want them to do. And there's no confusion about what we're asking them to do,
Right,
right?
right.
So when people are like, how does that work so well? Well, it's design. And so it's scope and sequence that's matched to instruction that takes into account those kind of environmental variables that can kind of add to distracting or kind of overloading students in the process.
So if a tier one teacher does what you just described, and again, we're looking at the fact fluency math, math facts, not the general math capabilities. But if they do that, I want to ask you a percentage, and I'm going to give it some context this time. So I think like in California, I know at one time, if you had over 10% of your kids identified for special ed, the state was going to come looking at you. because
Hmm.
you've identified too many kids.
Yes.
So if a teacher, and I would guess that only some of those kids would have some sort of deficit or discrepancy or whatever word I'm supposed to be using, today in math. It would be in math. So what would be an expectation of a classroom teacher doing this well? Could she expect 95% of the kids to be successful?
All right. I wish I could share screen with you. I literally have
Okay.
I have box plots up, and I know this
Okay.
doesn't help your audience, but let's put it this way. In first grade, the average kid was about at 6 problems, and the bottom quartile, so the 25th percentile was at about 4, and the upper 75th percentile was at around 12. And so after the 30 lessons, the average went from about 8 to 18, and the bottom quartile was from about probably 16 to 32. And the average is again right around that kind of 1920 area. But the point is, like in the box plots, they don't overlap. Does that make sense? So, I mean, are there kids that don't respond? Of course, but your bottom 25% of kids went from about 3 to 4 problems per minute to about probably 15, 16 problems per minute. And then your upper kids went from about probably, it looks around 13 to about 30.
And we're talking about a 6 week
Yeah,
intervention.
so that would be their sums to 10 growth.
Okay. So in a school year with 36 weeks,
Mhm.
we might not get that much growth replicated, but there will certainly be continued growth.
Yeah, they typically go across about 3 to 4 skills in a year. And we suggest right now that you kind of move those kids along uniformly because we don't want to overload teachers with having to juggle a bunch of balls. Although the ones that are using it, they're like, this works really good. But like, I feel like, some kids could really take off and run with this, which they can give them packets and just have them practice on the side. Right now, with tiered intervention, the kids that are non-responders, those kids probably need a double dose of this. And with those, you'd probably know very early on in the intervention process, like because of the small sets, like 4 per day, like you would see them grow from that baseline across all the problems on those first 4. You're going to want to see them go from like 8 to 16, 20, 23 problems, because it's on that small set and that shows that within session growth. And if you get a lot of within session growth across sessions, you're going to have good pre-post growth. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So and this is always, we always want to know, we use these words that are measurement words, but sometimes don't mean a lot. So what would be an expectation of proficiency or grade level or, what would we be shooting for in these?
I had the same conversation with the school earlier today, and this is how I want people to think about it. That's really simple and it cuts through all the psychometric jargon, right? So if a kid does 6 problems per minute, they're doing 1 problem every 10 seconds. That's horrible, right? If they do 10 problems a minute, that means a kid is getting a problem right on average every 6 seconds, right? So ask yourself as a teacher, if you're in 4th grade and you give a basic fact assessment and your average is 10, then that means if you show a kid 6 times 4 on average, it'll take him 6 seconds to answer it. Okay. Now, if we did that with a phonics card or like no one would stand for that. So then we get to 20, right? And obviously 20 is 1 problem right every 3 seconds. And then obviously you go up if you get 30 problems per minute. Now you got 1 problem every 2 seconds. And so there's a lot of people that have a lot of different criteria. This is mastery, this is instructional. And Matt Burns has done a lot of really great research on it, as Robin Cotting, and I've even done some. And kids need around 10 digits or 10 problems per minute at least to respond to things like explicit timing. And so, to me, 10 digits to 30 digits is what I have as an instructional range. And that just means that kids can independently kind of do time practice and they'll respond fairly well to it. If they're below that, then that's a frustration level. It's really hard. I mean, it's taking a kid 6 to 10 seconds to do every problem. And so they are deep in a burdensome, cumbersome, procedure at that point where they're counting or doing, whatever they're doing to come up with answers. And so in the spirit of the program, I want kids between 30 and 60 problems per minute. But I know if I go into schools and be like, well, we need to set our goal at 60 minutes or 60 problems per minute, you could get there with this program, but you couldn't get there in 6 minutes a day. You'd have to do a higher dose. And so when I design this, I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, I have to, if we don't provide a short enough amount of time, then nobody's going to adopt it. But if we don't do it for high enough dosage, then kids aren't going to respond. And so, basically I kind of went with the 6 minute time frame. And what we're seeing is it's getting your average kid pretty much around 25 problems per minute, which in sums to 18 and multiplication is around 40 to 50 correct digits per minute, which is in mastery ranges in most kind of research published criteria.
Well, it's interesting. You were gracious enough to share some correspondence you had with a teacher and asking your advice about how to move some students along. And one of the things that caught my attention that I hadn't thought of before was how quickly a student can actually write and form numbers with a pencil.
Yes.
And had never thought, are there any other confounding factors besides just knowing the facts and writing that you could think of that teachers should be aware of? Because, now we see that, handwriting is going to be, we're going to emphasize handwriting a little bit more. Any other factors that could confound the issues or?
I look at things as alterable variables, like things we can control. And so, I look at, I'm a behaviorist in my training and my philosophy. And so I always want to do direct observation of behaviors that are amenable to intervention and change. And so, are there biophysical, genetic, kind of caps on performance? Maybe. I can't change those. And I mean, for example, I did a research study one time. It was with second graders, and I shrunk the set, and we gave a lot of practice. But we got the entire second grade class to 80 digits correct per minute. I mean, people will be like, "Well, kids can't really do things that fast," and it's like, well, it depends on how much time you spend on it.
Well, it brings me to something else. I don't know if it was in the stuff that you sent me or somebody else talking about motivation. And I think of these kids, getting if they don't do well with their math facts fluency in the early grades, and there's not some sort of effective program like yours, they're doing the same stuff over and over again, day after day, year after year. That's got to be an important factor, the motivation.
It's a huge factor. And so, as a behaviorist, I refer to that as a learning history. And so when kids see things like computation facts on a page, yeah, and think about it. If you're a teacher and you're like, well, I know fact fluency is important, so I'm just going to go print a worksheet, and the worksheets are randomized and you do it once a week, you're literally wasting the child's time, right? Because you don't even know what problems they're doing, how many repetitions they're getting. And if it's hard for the kid, when you start at the beginning of the year, they're going to make no growth more than likely across the year. Now, compare that to, you take a very tightly controlled, and now they're practicing maybe, and teachers do this all the time, right? They do it with twos, and then they'll move to fives, and then they move to tens. And so they'll do these small sets and kids get those. The point is that eventually you got to interleave all of those together, and that's kind of what the fluency practice does. But if we think about, you would get small sets to build accuracy, but you also want to do small sets to build fluency to those really high levels. But then you have to be systematic about folding in new problems and interleaving. So, like in my program, I start with 4 problems and I end with 4 problems. But in that time, like they get exposed to all 36 problems. Now, you probably have people listening being like, what the hell is he talking about? 36 problems. So, what our research has shown is that zeros and ones, like most kids know those and they're rule governed. That's 33% of the problems. So, if there's 100 problems, you take out zeros and ones, boom, right out the gate, right? In addition, what we know is if a kid knows 3 plus 5, they generally know 5 plus 3. So, boom, now you take out half of the 72. That leaves you with 36 individual problems they need to work on automatizing.
You made me think of something I never asked anybody that actually knew the answer. So I always wondered, well, the kids know their twos and they're 2, 4, 6. It's almost like a song. Same thing with fives. Can't we do a song with sixes and sevens? No, I know you're laughing, but I'm serious. It's like the ones that they don't know, isn't it just as easy to start? Because it's not like they know the meanings or anything. It's like singing the alphabet, which will become useful information later, but they don't know what the letters
It,
mean. It's
it,
just a song.
why are songs important and why do they enhance learning in young children? Do you know?
That's why I have experts on the show.
Okay, so the ABC song. Do you know what song that is?
No.
Twinkle Little Star.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
So
Okay.
basically, when you like sing songs, what it does is it allows you, like, 'cause some people think it's all musical and they do all this, but no, it is a learning history and it cues how to organize information. And so they basically put the letters in order and they kind of hook it into that melody that a child should already know with Twinkle Little Star. And that's why it helps guide and cue that. So it's not a biophysical thing that our brains are wired for music. It's, it's about prior knowledge and automatized, over repetition with the nursery rhyme that you attach those letters to.
So could we find a song for sixes and sevens and eights?
Well, my guess is that, well, I know they're out there. And my guess is if you ask teachers, do you sing song you're skip counting? And then you would ask them, is it a different song for each number? And they would be, who would do that? That's dumb. No,
Yeah,
it's the
yeah,
same song, it's different numbers, right?
yeah.
And my guess is that's why. But again, when we think about explicit instruction and how we want to break things down into small chunks, but also attach it to our prior knowledge. That's why, things like that work. But I mean, I've talked to kindergarten teachers and they're just like, kids learn so good with music. And it's like, well, let's really think, and not that it's not true, it provides those hooks.
Yeah.
But, like learning is not magic, right? Like learning is not magic. And I wish people would get away from thinking like, well, if I knew their processing speed or if I knew this somehow would open up this magic. It's like, no, learning is really predictable. It's about what do they know? What am I going to teach? How do I task analyze and break that into components? And how do I systematically build on one of those, to put things together into larger skills? So if people really want to get into some awesome reading, precision teaching, and they literally talk about this as tool skills, which would be like writing numbers, and then component skills, which would be like your single digit facts, and then a component skill, which would be a multi-digit algorithm. And so if you want a kid to basically learn the composite skill, they need to have the tool skills and the component skills. And before you learn that component skill, single digit addition, you probably need to have those tool skills as well. And so everything's very sequential and built on everything you do instructionally should be dependent on what you've done before.
Well, I'm going to mention it one more time because if I have a listener who wants to try, a teacher who wants to try to go to those six, sevens, and eights earlier, because I have never talked to a teacher that did say, oh, they just have trouble with the six, sevens, and eights. And again, listening to you and what I know about instruction, it seemed like maybe those are the ones we should be hitting more. They should
Yeah.
get more frequency.
Now, are you
It's
talking addition or multiplication?
multiplication. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is I had a student come in, she was a professor's kid, just bright kid. And I was like, your math facts. And she literally she sang her sixes and sevens because I'm like, 6 times 7. And she's like, 7, 14, 21, 28,
Oh,
35. And I'm like, well, okay. But anyway, but the problem is with that is even if you taught that, that would give them access to respond to the stimulus like 6 times 7,
yeah.
right? But if kids use that now, we're usurping all that working memory to focus on a counting procedure, which would be skip counting. And so it puts you in the same exact problem of, well, what do you do when it's 729 times 34? We want them
Uh,
to see things, now I get it. It's a
okay.
bridge, right? It's a
Thanks
bridge.
for rating on my parade there, Brian.
I
Okay.
tried to write on your parade. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
I want to go way back to the beginning of this because you alluded to something, and I want to be clear, okay, about what do we do with the kids that don't get to those levels that we want, that we're expecting. And you mentioned some ways that the instruction might look different and I'm going to call it tier two, but I'm going to call it outside of the regular instruction. And you mentioned some things. You mentioned fewer problems in the set.
Mhm.
What else were some of the
Yeah,
things that a
yeah,
teacher
yeah.
might
So
do?
yeah, there's 5 points. As a school psychologist, when I had a treatment non-responder, I always look at 5 things. The first one is, are we on the right skill? And so that's where that scope and sequence is really important. And what I want to do, and think about a child that you want them to, have high oral reading fluency scores, but they don't. Well, then I would go back to, probably some, their nonsense word fluency. So kind of CVC, letter sounds, that kind of thing. And I would just make sure that those sub skills were known to kind of mastery levels. Right. And so the first thing is, so if your target is oral reading fluency, but the child's still at like 30 sounds per minute on their individual sounds, then the right intervention target isn't oral reading fluency, it's letter sound fluency. So the first thing you got to make sure is don't expect the child to grow on a skill when they don't have the prerequisites. Okay. And so that's the first thing. Are we targeting the right skill? So we do that. Now we're on the right skill, but now we need to know, are we matching, doing the right skill by treatment interaction? So Matt Burns does research on this skill by treatment interactions, and I'm going to assess them on those letter sounds or math facts. And if they're accurate, right, then I can just have them probably, do explicit timing and just, high rates of practice to get better. But if they're inaccurate, now if I do timed assessment, it's going to be very detrimental to the child, right? And so in that case, I need to do things like flashcard drill, cover, copy, compare, maybe tape problems, but you're going to have instructional components, that have antecedent and consequent procedures. So we're on the right skill. Now we need to see, is the child accurate or inaccurate? And then you're going to go ahead and choose interventions that incorporate those instructional components, because the instructional components need to build accuracy are different than what's going to be needed to build fluency. Okay,
Yeah.
so now
Yeah. I'm sorry,
so
go ahead.
now let's say we have those. Now, the third thing I'm going to check is motivation. Sometimes it's the right skill, it's the right topography, and kids aren't growing. And so now I'll add reinforcement, because and the reason why is because it's easy for a teacher to check out. But sometimes kids actually respond, right? They do the practice, but they're just not really focused in on the practice at all. Right. So it's kind of like that kid you talked about, like, I've done this forever. I don't like it. And so, like, if I go out and I'm practicing basketball, I can haphazardly throw up 100 shots, but it doesn't make me good. What would make me good, right, is if I'm focused on technique and where my elbow is and when I'm going to release my shot. So I can be very mindful about the practice that I'm engaging in. And so by providing a reward for kid to beat their previous score, what you do is you check to make sure they're giving optimal attention and engagement, within those intervention sessions.
So do your materials contain some sort of protocol or assessment for those sub areas that you just described, or it'd be kind of hit and miss for the teacher?
Not yet. I
Okay.
will be making two things. I'm working on a book right now, a second edition with Robin Cotting and Rob Volpe, and in the book, we're gonna go through this intensively. And then also, I'm going to this summer make an intervention manual for Mind 2.0. And within that, I'm going to subsume the other interventions, so it'll all be a single intervention, and
Yeah.
it will describe how to use this across tiers.
But I think if a teacher, is working with a student who, for whatever reason, is in that tier two environment, if they start with something and that's not it, they can move on to something else. It doesn't have to be this formal type of assessment to move them on.
Well, it's just formal hypothesis testing, right?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So with the small sets, what's so cool about it is you don't have to wait a long time to know whether it's going to work or not, right? So you can do a can't do, won't do assessment. If a child's not really growing, and you could be like, well, I'll give you 5 minutes of tablet time if you can beat your score. And if the kid jumps, like 50 to 100% on their score, so they go from like 7 to 12, then think about if every single time the child practiced their math facts, they were more engaged and they nearly doubled their practice. You're going to see better long-term gains, right? But let's say you assess the kid and they don't get any better. And we all know these kids, they're trying hard, they're doing the work, but they're not responding. And so you're like, well, should I back up a skill? You assess that and you're like, no. And so then that's when you're like, now I'm going to increase the dose. That's the fourth thing you can do. You can just say, instead of doing facts on fire for 6 minutes a day, now I'm going to do it for 12 minutes a day. And we're going to see if that works. And so there's research out there that shows kids are non-responders at one level, but then you increase that dose and then they'll finally respond, right? And then the last and final one, and this is especially relevant for students with severe disabilities, is, if I have a set of 12, it may just be too many items for them to focus on at once, and so because the more items you have, the less repetitions per session you're going to have. So then you shrink the set size. That's the fifth thing. And so then you might use the same intervention, but you shrink the set. And so again, instead of doing like 8 items with, 10 repetitions, you could do 4 items with 20 repetitions. Does that make sense to you?
That
And
makes
so
sense.
you basically would kind of, so the whole goal is, regardless of the child's disability or processing speed or any of this stuff, how can I systematically manipulate the instructional components that are alterable so I can find the conditions under which this child is successful, right? And again, all you can do is, what does the child know? What do you want to learn them to learn? You shrink it down into bite-sized pieces, and then you literally make sure they're engaged, they get ample opportunities to respond, and they get those repetitions to have within session growth. And then after they have within session growth, now the next day you're going to check to see if they maintain that growth, right? Because again, all kids learn pretty much the same way. It's just a different in the rate in which they learn and the rate in which they forget. And so again, in my view, learning is a very predictable exercise. The complexity isn't in the instruction, it's actually in the curriculum. And so it's really about how kind of distill and break up those component pieces and systematically put those together, and the degree of automaticity which you program those prerequisite skills so that they link to the new information.
So and you've done this several times today, you have also compared this to reading. And so and now you've said learning is predictable, it's the curriculum. So having said that, if the teacher gets better at doing these interventions, gosh, I hate to use those words. If the teacher, gets better at this instruction with these kids in math, it's going to carry over into the instruction in language arts and reading and other things because the learning is learning. And
And yes, and the thing is, and this is, I have a saying, I say this on podcasts, so I'm not trying to be redundant, but empirically validated interventions were really cool to me when I was young, but it didn't take me long to realize that it's really kind of, it's not all that helpful of a term, because you can take an empirically validated intervention and in one context it'll work great, in another context it won't work at all. And so, to really be an expert, with, as teachers are, you really begin to figure out the context under which this intervention works and this one doesn't. And that's where that skill by treatment interaction stuff comes in. So, it is actually, and so again, like when we get into, well, should we do explicit instruction or inquiry based instruction? There's times when inquiry based instruction is the right thing to do. Right. But that is in, like, if we talk about the instructional hierarchy or explicit instruction, it's at the end when we know kids have the prerequisite skills. And now we want those kids to kind of model, whatever more kind of larger database problem solving or critical thinking skill or whatever it is, which is basically a multi-step procedure where they're going to put those things together. And, and again, I think that's what a lot of the, kind of progressive folks, they really love that type of instruction and outcomes because that's what experts do. But I think the explicit people are like, well, we want that too, but we got to start very controlled. And so it's not balanced by any means. It is literally about, with your building accuracy, you do this. When you're building fluency, you do this. And when you kind of program generalization is what we call it. But basically, when you're applying skills to controlled, kind of settings, that would be pretty explicit. But then when we get people into novel problem solving, then that's highly independent. And that's when inquiry-based, problem-based approaches, when you have assessed and know kids have the prerequisite skills, when those are highly useful.
all right, well, Brian, I think that's a good place to leave it. I think for me, the most important thing that I got out of this conversation is that like all programs, it's going to take the expertise of the teacher to manage it. The program isn't magic. The program isn't magic. You have to, as they say, you got to work the program and then take that data and what did you call it? Hypothesis.
Yeah, yeah, it's called inductive hypothesis
Yeah,
testing,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
which is another just way of saying kids are really complicated. But we want to use if then statements. So we make a hypothesis. I think a kid is struggling because they can't accurately respond. So if I do this instruction, they'll learn how to accurately respond.
Well, I think your stuff is a good place to start. And I think that's how we become expert. We use somebody else's stuff and then we take care of the nuances
Yeah,
after we
that's
have
right.
some fluency with that and some generalization. Well, Brian, do you have any questions for me?
Oh man, I do. So, listening to your podcast, I know as an instructional coach, in your notes, you talk to me about working and getting in special education. A lot of kids are reported to have processing difficulties.
Yes.
Okay. And so my question to you as an instructional coach is, do you feel that, kind of fixating on within child hypothetical constructs like processing speed, did you see teachers using that as an off ramp to justify why students can't learn things that typical students learn?
Well, first of all, I'm kind of laughing because whenever I work with a teacher, and we do lesson design for we'll meet for a coaching cycle. We'll meet to talk about a lesson, and then observe the lesson, and then debrief it. Usually, the first meeting to talk about lesson design, that's when I find out. Well, I have this many English learners. I have this many kids on RSP. This, you know what? And I don't care, because we're going to do the instruction because what I have found is that there is the more effective the instruction, you're just eliminating that variable from what's happening. There's enough confounding issues going on in the classroom. Let's not instruction be one of them. Let's be sure we're giving opportunities to respond. Let's be sure we've had clear explanations, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I don't even listen. I don't even want to hear it. In fact, I've said this over and over again. I was a principal and I was not a good principal. I didn't know what I know now when I was a principal. And if today I were to go back and I would get some sort of referral for a student study team, or, I don't know what they call them in different places, but just, it's kind of like one of the steps to get to a special ed referral, things that you need to do. I wouldn't even accept it until I was clear that instruction was going well. There was a, oh gosh, how long ago was this? This was in the 90s. California, which is where I am, they decided they were going to do class size reduction. And they were using data and studies done in Tennessee that they reduced class sizes, everything, just a lot of good things happened. California did it and they went down to 20 to 1. Tennessee was like about 13 to 1, So we're still not even close. But so 20 to 1, it was better. And one of the rationales for doing that is because with a smaller class size, we would have fewer special ed referrals. The teacher would be able to, and it didn't happen. The teachers that had the most special ed referrals with 28 kids had the same percentage at 20 kids. And so if a teacher's telling me, all about their kids, I don't want to hear it. Let's take care of the variable of the best instruction that we can give with appropriate materials, and then we'll take a look. And the other thing that we say is that, you're always going to have some kids that are not going to be successful in a particular lesson. And guess what? You're going to have a much smaller subset of your class if the instruction was done well, as effective. And then guess what you're going to do? You're going to pull that small group of kids and do the types of things that you're talking about. Maybe fewer repetitions, maybe, what all those things that we can do to provide support. But that group that you're going to pull at the end is going to be fluid. Instead of just saying these kids aren't going to get it, we're going to give them a shot to get it. And then, okay, now let's do it. And I think the teachers found that, and I think it gets back to some motivation too. When the kids that never were able to do things started being able to do things, not only their motivation increased, but the teacher's sense of efficacy increased. So yeah, I don't even want to hear that, Brian, when I'm working with.
Well, here's an easy question for you. Where did you play football?
Northern Arizona.
Northern Arizona.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I heard that you were a football star back in your younger days.
Well, back in my younger days was a long time ago, Brian. So anyway, yeah, that was an easy one. But anyway, Brian, it has been a pleasure chatting with you. And glad we got to see whatever. I know it's not in person, but as close as we're going to get.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. Doing podcasts with me is kind of like herding cats. And so I feel for you, but hopefully we got some good nuggets of info out. And so, yeah, just for, teachers, look at the website, try the stuff out. It's www.factsonfire.com. People are finding really good success with it, and the kids like it. And, I've really tried to make it easy for teachers and effective for students. And that's a good combination to have.
Now, if that daughter of your friend ever comes in your office again, do a recording of her 6, 7s, and 8s for me, would you?
I will do that.
All right, Brian, thanks a lot.
All right, take care.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at @GTavernetti, on Twitter, X @GTavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused, Adaptable, Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.